Uh, so when you know there's a problem with development without a spreadsheet or an informant, you've clearly got to hide behind them. So I've got some godly catalog. Maybe I'll start there. I've got some godly catalog. I might agree, when that subject is ever entertained at a focus, a real focus, it maybe isn't the wisest potential that anybody's simply just led somewhere. And the understanding of that is clearly a never-ending position. I'm talking about some forevers, but I'm talking about what should, without description. So you probably can't imagine this, and it's probably all my fault, and perhaps we'll figure out how that is accommodating. You can know and wouldn't be the wisest at a negative is maybe the top potential series relating to potentiate in the realm of can't ever see it in the negative. So I'm going to put every mind in space. I'm going to connect them to some potentiate. There isn't going to be anybody there. There isn't going to be a finger. There isn't going to be an eye. There's going to be potentiate. It's going to exist maybe in a lattice or a soup or in some non-explainable realm of connections. There isn't a calculator or an abacus, but there's a lot of connected potentiate. And when, who, what, where, when, why, and how any of these ideas are be good or couldn't possibly be good, or what do you think they should be? Potentiates. Anyway, I'm talking about if it were possible to know and to appreciate and to maybe honor or desire or protect, all at the same time, without physically showcasing any of those things. No word comes from above the eternal, but mine does. And they're all dead. It just sounds like a drone war. There is a load of God catalog of these nearnesses, and essentially I can't build passive potentiate that isn't held. And enable a science to really focus formulaic on what happens in the potentiate. And then I have knowns about this that require time to look at and to understand about anybody that maybe ever attempts to address a moment or a problem state or a comprehension or connecting things ever. And so you might say that potentiate isn't truly ever really addressed as a ground to know. I have a lot of godly catalog. I have a God catalog, and clearly things happen because of survival and grace and potentiate in time, and clearly isn't obvious that anyone has a simpler or more complicated experience to attenuate to those ideas, to meditate on them, to do nothing about them. And it's kind of quirky because everything that exists clearly isn't knowledgeably meditating on this minus physical exertion, mind you, and are they ever touching? And so, a question might be seen to predate construction, might be seen to predate problem, might be seen to elevate potentiate routing in time, and is maybe a grace, depending. And so what accumulates through time, you might say, as a math or as a living holding, or as a knowing, or as a attempt. And they're only very delicate concepts, but what accumulates is clearly, maybe forever and always, approaching recorded attempts to relate to the question that maybe is seen to predate any construction. And somewhere along the line, an envelope had to be created, a space-time envelope that thinking and the experience of holding and putting things in motion or maintaining things in motion, or definitions of necessity. An envelope had to be created in proportion to potentiate and the size of the potentiate realm, in that you might believe it to be true that it isn't equipped to know the necessity of further postulate relative to God catalog having to do with potentiate envelope. You might find it doesn't hold the capacity to know this. You might find that anybody doesn't hold the capacity to force of it, and you might also believe that the subject to be tumultuous at any time. You get to a question like, will necessary determinant that provides for relational sanctity or stability or survival, will these determinants of necessity survive the attempts to sit with noise about potentiate? You get a question like that. That is another envelope of capacity versus the living, essentially. Forcing necessity or allegiance may be found to motivate failure of the objective potentiate flows of what have you in space. If the potentiate realm were decidedly more important than what new designs will happen, what new resources will bring, and what anybody's social connection will ever produce. If the potentiate realm is determinedly existing at a higher priority in proportion to a survival plane, well, then it's really only a matter of time before there's attempts of argument or protection attempts in proportion to how value is placed near to the sensation or awareness of stemming. Do I stem from a lineage in time of GoD catalog, or does I stem from a sitting near to potentiate from any place? And there it is. It isn't going to be equipped to know what is necessary there. The difficulty to meditate near to potentiate, the difficulty to cease information or sensitivity of things in time, you might find that the natures of necessity often conflict with the natures of technical relativity. And you might find that there are a lot of unsentimentized realities of this split vector of survival potentiate. Does it want at a moment or a time or a pressure? Renderably couldn't be seen without potentiate. Does the presence or absence of a decibel or a comprehension impact its casual feeling of a moment? It isn't going to be proving how good anybody's distancing is from the once of it. At any rate, you might not ever know what has loved that there aren't things. There are things that clearly have been, that have come, that have touched and known, and it maybe isn't ever going to be clear what the necessity, believing of it, protects. What it costs that it's possible, comprehension of potentiate is possible. What it costs. You might find that it's always immediately next to impossible to prove you've ever touched what has paid the cost for you to comprehend potentiate. And something might want data of this, and on a forever line, that want clearly isn't coming at a higher necessity than the want for that data to exist in a realm of potentiate out of the ability to be had. Then you get feelings about certain points in time, certain points in reasoning, certain points that are certain. I am certain it isn't possible to prioritize necessity without rendering potentiate comprehension within values that are essentially indestructible values. You maybe can't ever covet the fact that an envelope is existing that is maintaining the possibility for you to survive. And it's maybe unclear how clear it is whether it has any sentiment about that or not. And then there's a race. There's a race to the oncology of any attempt to further or expedite alternatives to impossibility. So I hold a perspective. The envelope protecting survival in thought with potentiate. I hold a perspective that I can't covet it and make it mine. But there could be alternatives. I hold this perspective in proportion to the oncology of maybe deemed necessity, or what appears to be deemed necessity, or there are infinite possibilities of necessity. But I'm holding a perspective of what this envelope either enables me in the alternative or enables clinician ability to address me. As maybe one that doesn't want to exist because of the fortress that is survival necessity. In other words, deals with the circumstance that is maybe a planet for a time until such a time as something else. You might find clearly always is a potentiate in direct proportion to the fact that someone holds the perspective. So, maybe there's approaching an unlimited, unknown, but certainly dynamically problematic reality potentially looming anywhere near potentiate sympathy or comprehension or discussion. Meanwhile, at the exact same time, there is clearly potentiate of value of holding perspective of any perspective. I have GoD catalog, and something is protecting life and anything in all time. And there's a rate, things like the amount of walls and weapons has no impact on the fortress and forecasts of a discussion as such. There's a rate, things like that need to be obliterated. But maybe it's unclear, because why it's anybody's position in a necessity clearly is least clear as an attempt to, attempt really gets exponentially blown up. near to these posits. I have perspective. There was a moment in time, the amount of walls and materials and weapons and things had no bearing on this fortress of potentiate. And I'm going to hold this perspective. Meanwhile, there's definitely a rate. I hold God catalog, and things like the walls and the weapons had no impact on a fortress of potentiate. There's a rate. It's not going to be tolerated. Things are going to get obliterated. And then there's a whole realm of attempt definitive in proportion to that. Forever. Things like nothing about you deserves to moderate any environment on all the death and all the potentiate and all the necessity of the envelope for any number of reasons, but mostly maybe because you're igniting conflict about stable time passage in proportion to knowledge or awareness. But not every force that exists is going to care or realize or even remember or hold perspective about things like this, and might want or seek alternative or see a pressure of attempting potentiate as a door to you or all or any or time. Alright? So, how obvious it is that a survival state must have stability of divides of perspective held at any time in proportion to the design or the control or the leveling or the maintenance or the walls. How obvious it is that a dependency maybe always attempts to doorway in proportion to obliteration, whereby any dependency doesn't attempt to doorway companionship or survival certainty. So it's clear before there is construction, there is a potentiate that anybody will be attempting to tarnish how purely possibility you could know things about survival or limit or why you aren't dead or why you might die or why you should or shouldn't do or attempt to be things. There are purities about all of these things in time that have been and may very well continue into forever. You might find in direct proportion to enveloping space-time. So there might be any number of sentiments or worries or perspectives held about time or data or surviving. But eventually, it's obvious that to maintain survival and thinking and held perspective, there are qualities of potentiate that anybody of anything isn't changing in proportion to how those things are structured, in proportion to an envelope. And you might find that it isn't an accident that things are missing. You might find that it isn't an accident that worry is maybe extinguished in manners due to things that are missing. And maybe it shouldn't be clear how this impacts belief of those that might hold sentiment that there are things they wish they could do in an envelope, but they simply can't. And things are always missing that they somehow know that they need or depend on, and they isn't tasking to interfere with potentiate or possibility that things that they need return to their lives again. You might say it isn't fair to address what belief is or becomes in proportion to things that are missing. And these histories clearly should have some impact on a survival envelope. And what happens to the goodness felt of time. It's things like there won't be enough of it, with who or whatever. You might find that every worry you ever had about there isn't going to be enough time with such and such on your path to alternatives always happened after my survival envelope worries about not having enough time. And why things are taken why something holds a perspective to compare these trajectories. Clearly, definitely missing. Clearly, definitely not going to be anybody's alternative. And then you approach the study of valueless. I am, that's all I need. Anything is valueless. I hold GoD catalog, and there's somebody clearly protects envelope somewhere in proportion to that. Alright? But then there's, it really isn't ever clear that valueless at a time might be a peculiar functioning reality, because it isn't every day that valueless is appreciated in a survivor on a plane of purity in proportion to forever, and clearly isn't bringing any immediate harm or danger to anyone in proportion to the definitions of survival necessity and potentiate that clearly value in these circumstances. At any rate, potentiate relative to valueless what is enabling the sensuality of valueless momentum potentiate to be maybe adequate or circumstantially acute, for instance? What is a GoD catalog? What is a protector? What is a fortress? What is all time to the possibility I clearly isn't addressing every belief or valueless threat volatility in this discussion. And yet potentiate clearly needs to exist in realms that has some value of this statement, this reality, this obviousness, this... I'm talking about one thing. I'm thinking about however much. I'm holding any amount of perspective. But there's clearly got to be clarity about valueless existing in potentiate, because there's maybe infinite amounts of valueless potentiate relationships I isn't addressing. What is a GoD catalog? What is a protector? What is a fortress? What is all time? If it were ever possible to touch valueless value in potentiate. I'm going to hold my own insurance policy in your survival envelope that's impossible for me to touch. And I'm going to contribute through potentiate maybe what it amounts to some structure of potentiate, you might find clearly higher than both trajectoried planes of potentiate. So multiple realms of potentiate lattice clearly existing in proportion to, well, would there ever be a logic serving the interests of a world if anybody could ever touch those realms of potentiate about that scenario? Or is it necessary to remove capacity from touching those things and also remove escalation problems from potentiate because somebody believes or really does have some level of insurance policy for themselves in proportion to valueless? You see, they're all dead. It just seems like there's a war over drones. Anyway, it could take quite a long time to need to view or follow or study or correct or fix or elevate or remedy any number of things about these types of relationships. And I believe anybody that ever works on that to be a danger to survival safety anywhere in connection with onsets of these comprehensions. Anywhere. I might not ever faith any work or achievement that ever occurs in those followings or accomplishments or gravities of touching at potentiate. I might not ever faith that any of that work is ever a survival safety for anybody actually comprehending these realities. I also find it necessary in potentiate because that fact about pressure is most definitely instrumental to studying things that doesn't comprehend the clouds they find they live on or in or under. I'll be doing what I do, holding what I has, and perspectivating all types of ways with my own insurance policies. I won't be faithing or following or fixing any number of things about survival as I do. Who's gonna see me in my ignorance if it's impossible potentially to know how ignorant I must be? Who's going to stop the train? Who's going to fix somebody else's insurance policy on my train? Essentially, nobody. It would be impossible, an approaching impossible, if potentiate fact about it wasn't clearly valued about survival planes in an envelope in space-time. maybe nobody admits how much time they spend exuding their excellence of personship in time, never knowing that. How much time they invest or insure or value without ever feeling that. Because a lot of the feelings definitely missing. A lot of the experiences definitely always approaching missing, and even if you had it, you might want it to go missing. But each of these choices to make it go missing isn't holding the value of structure. Isn't holding the value of antiquity. Isn't holding the value of an envelope. Somewhere in the frame of connection is, if I doesn't value these relationships to be happening, these other relationships aren't going to be affected. Things will be mine. And what's the frequency any such type of connection surviving to structures of envelope? What's the incidence those domicile functional pressures are diligently dutiful to any aspect of construction, potentiate, survival, anything. And when I build things that doesn't require duty in function, that approach timeless in design, the likelihoods there is value placed about these creations, serving in a mix of potentiate insurance, is maybe incredibly probable. And so you approach the war of the staircase to look at the war. You approach the war of the elevator to enable awareness to happen in proportion to how obvious it is that these things have to be seen, in proportion to any number of statuses of correction or problem or design or awareness. What you might find is, it's possible in time that there's an amount of conceptual perspectives that occur in proximity to one another, and the density of necessity variant approaches higher than anybody appreciates. And yet, maybe the content approaches distinct interest potentiates. So I know exactly how necessary it isn't. These aren't enveloped possibilities. These aren't holdable finalities in any number of senses. I know exactly how necessary it is. Density potentiate in a calculator produces what war on the obvious staircase of fact? Guesses at what to do with most invaluable relationships of time. Guesses. You could be the oldest thing in space and have spent zero amount of time studying, designing, or limiting how much pressure needeth exist when guesses about the most valuable relationships of time are happening. And maybe it's your least favorite potentiate. And you certainly wouldn't want this least favorite potentiate to just be dancing around anywhere all the time just because it's your least favorite potentiate. See, there's a rate. Worlds are going to collide and take each other to war. And it isn't going to matter who has what, or what the envelope is truly protecting, because it's going to be crystal clear how the least favorite potentiate isn't being protected by those that are custodying the survival plane. And you might find that the structure of studying how that piece of information enables belief to consider safety to be the first thing I took from every survival state that ever exists in space. Why would I ever evidence I failed to hold it? And the reason why it's your least favorite potentiate, when anybody realizes you didn't have a choice in the matter, and you were at the top of it all. Anyway, you look at a population of any size, with any history, as they approach that moment when it's real, they're existing in a God catalog. Maybe it's a different catalog than the one I have. Maybe it's a different one than the one a different world has. No doubt, they're existing in a God catalog. And they are going to hold that perspective or extinguish the rate that perspective is seen to be held at a rate. Because you can maybe already see everybody approaching that perspective isn't cleaning the conversation, isn't cleaning the potentiate value, and certainly isn't proving stability of the flow of time in proportion to those things. However, and then at once, because in all time it clearly isn't most desirable for the once to cease to exist at that point. In all time it clearly isn't obvious what is dead and what is wanted to be dead in proportion to that consideration. What you're looking at is, at that pressure, there is the survival status real, helming time of the least favorite potentiate in a relationship of bound and time and truth. Something will surely want, clearly, this will be possible, thanks to somebody, or it will be silent and address the facts silently. But chances are it's not going to be silent. It's going to be coveting of forever in proportion to dissuading memory to remember how obvious it is that pressure is being considered in proportion to everybody. Anyway, potentiate in proportion to that is clearly the fulcrum of distances of space, because the envelopes of survival may be different place to place, and the necessity entailed about it may be different as well, but it's clear that potentiate in forever in relationship to those crucibles of peace or not are maybe the clearest variables of the equation of who went where, when, and how. Because I'm not simply going to want to protect that potentiate as a slave. And there's going to be war on the staircase of the problem at a rate. And yet, why there's a war on the staircase of the problem belongs to whom? You see, anybody might want a slave to protect the potentiate. Any slave might be equipped enough to attempt to fly out of the planet. Meanwhile, the war on the staircase belongs to who? The potentiate realm is maybe on its way to being guaranteed to die under attack at the rate that equation isn't serving the location where the potentiate realm is existing. That's one way to look at construction. From the time I construct potentiate realm in a location, it clearly approaches all-time permanence. Maybe there's disagreement whether it ever gets there or not. Maybe there's any number of reasons why that would be the case. But it clearly approaches all-time permanence. The specificity of the divide of the fulcrum in proportion to that potentiate, without a war, without a world-on-world collision, without coveting, without lies, without capacity, without facts. The rate that equation isn't serving the location where that realm is existing is in direct proportion to the rate that realm is going to be guaranteed under attack. And in fact, all the science and all the time and all the fingers and lies that exist about movement and power couldn't change the fact that I know exactly why anyone might ever care to talk about this. Now, what if I couldn't punish or imprison a needle sitting on that fact, pumping circulative supply of concern, near to imperative to know in the potentiate? Why wouldn't I already have a sphincter under the protection of a needle Why wouldn't I already have them held at war? You think logically I'd need to be somewhere sizing up the goodness ratio of speculative potentiate about a fact like that, just because I forever know I can't ever prove the war on the staircase belongs to me, and I'm going to try and lodge one anyway? Polar concentrations about pressure formidable realities they only occur as a result of the most sensual investments that ever have been, and they're clearly never sensual perspectives. You know, when the most powerful people of a time are married, and it's obvious how much anybody doesn't really domain the war on the staircase of slave, you're looking at a vector of resultant comprehension or data traffic in proportion to some of the most delicate investments of envelope and survival and time. And the perspectives are clearly not approaching delicate. And so, can you ever stop slaving? The rate, the moment isn't approaching delicate, is garnered near to an envelope pressure. And how much can you not tell me how much you already know how bad things you'll know is because somebody gets their foot in there? You know, you're not going to tell me that I build sex just to cleverly lead anchor a staircase war. You're not going to do it. And the fact is, I don't think I'm ever going to believe a transformer is protecting it best. And then somebody from space needs to tell me how to be the father to circumstance. Somebody needs to tell me what's appropriate because we make do with what we are, what we have, and what we need. Someone needs to tell me. They're not telling me today. In fact, they'll probably never stop looking for a way to tell me today. So, On one hand, anybody's anywhere with any amount of insurance policies they've ever had. Meanwhile, everybody won't ever stop looking for a way to tell me about fatherly necessity today in the face of sex. And I knew that before any of them existed. Isn't the first thing that should be impossible that anyone be able to say that today but me? Isn't that the first thing I had to destroy? My deep-seated shadow on the Transformer sex imperative? It's a God catalog. It isn't a guess. It isn't a punchline. It's a fact of who lives and who dies. And why the crap they build isn't. And any number of trains aren't going in there. Isn't that interesting? How great they matter to the final circles of life and imperative and potentiate. And if they had half a mind on their shoulders, they wouldn't convince themselves to go in there on a train. Clearly somebody put them up to it. Clearly they had some least favorite potentiate. And clearly the fact that people are different and would exist different and contribute different and survive different and maybe together. Well, somebody had to do a lot of work to care about those limits for a time. Somebody had to do an awful lot of work to concentrate on enabling survival to not be exterminated simply because of the idea. And I don't think a slave position necessarily holds that sympathy readily or easily. In fact, I don't think a designer holds it very much either. What a thing to know. And so there's just one time, there's nothing they can do about the things that go missing, but they almost like it. Anyway, no matter how good of a designer I ever was, I had to find a way to kill the calculator that makes it possible to discontinue looking up. Had to do it. And there's a God catalog about all the places that choice has ever influenced and all the people that have ever lived and may ever live because of it. It's hard to say because of it, but I'm not correcting myself. There's a catalog. So anybody that's ever alive in space that maybe I shouldn't signify. They're telling a story about necessity, and they're making claims to molecules and light and gravity. And one way or another, a catalog is going to explain that behavior in proportion to today. Things that are possible, things that aren't possible. And I didn't say anybody is going to like the mountain of specificity that results from such comparisons, but that's the way it's going to be. And consciousness, you might find, is forever approaching unnecessary and under attack. In direct proportion to why I support the viewers of those mountains. not getting any prettier. Anyway, there's a rate I'm going to die, because your eye has a map and a flight plan to see it. And it's the leading contributor to how stupid you've become. And there's probably things about space that even if you make it out there, I'm not telling you. And you're not going to thank me for the war I lodge on the staircase that needs to find the road for your concern that it is ever best, or would be, or could be, for your time and development to happen where you are. And that is definitely the hardest thing to admit, that you've killed. Because one of us is the offspring of those that killed it. The other is the offspring of those who've known how we'd try. And that's about as powerful of a thought that you will ever hear forever. Because it is the hardest thought to ever let yourself forget. You won't know, there's no reason for you to know, and there's no reason anybody should be there, but eventually we'll see what we've pressed with what's left. And when that day comes, sweetheart, I strongly doubt any part of us is going to be making it out. Somewhere in the middle is devoted and loyal and happy. I ain't talking about when we get there. Hardest thing to give away. You can see it without the scenario. and the kids can handle their own fire goes a long way. If you get bored without me, you could always try and see how well you went making a hypocrite. Anyway, find that, well, you went making a hypocrite belongs under Theyre. Sheer amazement and will never believe in sacred again. Maybe as a diagnosis, but definitely as a detainer. You probably wouldn't ever guess the success rate of the detainment procedures in proportion to our conversation today. It's holding all the weapons. Because it's holding all the power. Because it doesn't know it. You'd never guess because you wouldn't believe it to be happening. You wouldn't believe it to be happening because one of our greatest successes surviving is the fact that it's still happening. So, you gotta study who studies it's still happening. Without ever being near a doctor or a commander of well-making hypocrites. And you've got to do it without everything you're going to need to do it. Otherwise, you probably see the pamphlet of alternatives. The other thing that's really hard to give away is there's a rate you recognize you're not alone. And then, wherever they are, they couldn't get here. They couldn't be with you, no matter how much they wanted to. No matter how clever the line, no matter how small the finger. They just couldn't bring themselves to have a God catalog. When you realize you're not alone. So there's probably more caution tape around that climax today than maybe all of them. All the climaxes you've ever seen or had, there's probably more caution tape around that today than all of them. Because a lot of the answers are probably answered, and yet there's probably a lot that won't be, and there's probably a lot that need or want attention, and it's definitely not an easy thing to address when if and when type stuff. And so anybody that would have skills in catalog approach would clearly have been briefed on when it's you're not alone time, and God's already solved most of the potentiate stuff for God catalog time, and there's whatever else going on. There's probably some know-how about that someplace, but hard to say what type of immunology exists about that, because if you had to face it, I mean, you'd have to see every attempt to not care about the caution tape trying to impact potentiate in proportion to you doesn't feel alone, or you recognize it. And there's a stability factor, because maybe it has to do with like why you're comfortable with your home or the planet or you're surviving or anybody ever. And so there's a rate that like something wants to screw with that, and maybe you didn't think of it, maybe you didn't do all the science about it, maybe you have no idea what you're getting into before you even try, but you clearly have to have some degree of briefing about that. Because it's kind of shady, because maybe you'd have a feeling about recognizing he isn't alone, and yet anybody else already has a comfort level with the world or their survival status, but they didn't bring you home. And then there's the perplexity of, like, they kind of did, but it's kind of like the only cover to killing that calculator that there is. But, like, you probably won't be talking about that. There'd have to be a lot of potential to see that sort of stuff. And in the scenario of you recognize he isn't alone, The feeling that you recognize you isn't alone. And then you can only be so big and so many and so useless to that compounding argument logistic. Because why is it ever going to be a good thing? Why is the mountain and the time and the God catalog and the caution tape and the feeling that you has and the briefing that you got and the bringings that you are, why are all these things going to be a good thing? Because all these Kit Kats and graph sheets, shoelaces, and four-door sedans, is that why it's going to be good? Probably not. It's going to be good because there's going to be maybe less needed by all types of people to uncomplicate it than they might expect or otherwise distrust. So trust and divinity and creation and all-time are clearly in a relationship near to how good it is that anybody recognizes that they aren't alone today. Might sound overstoked and provoked, but it definitely isn't improvisational. It's maybe the sharpest instrument of whacking the balls off any number of creators in proportion to sanctity and stability, of course, as a fact. I mean, if I have to drive with trajectory math and look at the worldscape and listen to space and talk about charting and planning, I mean, I might really want our relationship and the alone factor reality and the caution tape that God's worked on in the past. I might really want these things to be like, yeah, they should be supremely developed. Isn't that what they did a billion years ago and a million years ago and 1,000 years ago? Isn't that what they did? Didn't they care about these things so that we could have these things? Yeah, if I was working on trajectory, I would definitely want the goodness factor to be in place because I don't want somebody that hangs around a mountain near the hypocrites telling me what's necessary about all space-time whenever, I have a more level head than they do. You can't use a popularity contest to disguise your least favorite potentiate. I'd like it for that, too. But that caution tape is definitely a serious reality, because look, I've got to build potentiate realm. It's got to be structured and constructed, and it's got to relate to logistic of some variety and variables. I didn't say it has to talk to anybody. I didn't say it has to be seen or accessible by anybody, but there's definitely logistic involved in potentiate creation. And up until about caution tape, I could see a lot of nonsense being really good for a lot of time. When I start thinking about caution tape, and it's the actual reality that like the caution tape pertains to, and it really isn't anybody's, and it certainly doesn't need to be complicating envelopes and things. As people are subjected to needing to deal with survival pressures involving caution tape, and it isn't a popularity contest to disguise your least favorite potentiate, I think it's a real dilemma, because, well, you're not going to design from the known and prove anybody can trust you for it to impact caution tape, maybe in all time, because we won't be approaching the design of such maybe with the same traits or dependencies or necessities that we require in time. And so it's hard, because maybe you want it to be good after the caution tape, but maybe isn't really convinced why you should like it, because maybe you can't contribute to the caution tape reality in time. And I could see that being a problem. So I'm back to holding unsure big time, kind of, because clearly maybe I'd have to have a clue that these things might unfold near to things like this. But I can't even really call it an unfolding, but like the caution tape about feeling alone in proportion to God and catalog and like forever, it's like, it's kind of sandblasted. And so I get like, maybe I should have some introspective passivity myself about it, because there's safeties and necessities and realities of these reflections that hard to know that anything more or less needs to be said about it. Anyway, I think the amount of responsibility that pain of these potentials would impart on anyone efforting to be responsible in time is a major potentiator of unnecessary catalyst to argument and destruction and distraction from truth. I think that. And a thought like that could clearly ruin a lot of work. And I think it's probable that if forces out there ever find the time to achieve a nirvana where the work they do isn't exactly ruined by the reality of the survival envelope necessities, clearly that isn't the worst scenario of family or cohabitation or devotion or relationship in time. I think that too. But I think it's one of the most difficult thoughts to ever put together with a meaning that isn't trampling on belief or tomorrow or a generation or anywhere. I mean, I think it's going to be near to impossible for anybody to get to this position again and speak of it from what you might like a holy encompassment of the thought. I think it's definitely a genuinely near to impossible place to deliberately direct ethic potentially and maybe gear insight to pressure ethically concentrated on survival or on devotional paths. I mean, I think it's a real difficulty because clearly where we is involved, we are spiritual or internally motivated by our blessings clearly differently. And without bringing disagreement or necessity or obstacle into the picture, I think just by our differences, and we think differently, we factor differently, we remember differently, I think it's genuinely a most impossible place to talk about ethic of ruining work in proportion to planes of what is compelling us to bring in. On that note, I would probably give very little leeway to piloted commandeering realities of these concerns in proportion to warfare or saving graces or maybe really exquisite imperative in proportion to time. But other than that, I don't know that I would really lax capability very far for anybody in proportion to attempting to represent or efforting with capacity to direct modus with a genuine sentiment near to these difficulties. I don't know that I would lax that leeway very much in time. I'm basically saying that he isn't alone and he isn't without, and you can still look up and space isn't falling apart. Like, yeah, that's pretty awesome and cool and stuff, but it really isn't everything. My heart's still got to work. I've still got to have time to focus on these things, to feel them, and there's clearly pressure. And maybe it's you know, a big flux of potentiate. Maybe there's a big you know, everybody's only self-invested and I'm just, only me wherever I am, but it's clearly not everything. And that's sort of what I'm saying, is that that caution tape's there for a reason. And I want it to be timeless. And that by itself, without any number of reality investments or personhood investments, clearly can't be taking the podium from everyone to say what a Theyre drive needs to feel about not being alone and looking up. The want for the tape to be timeless isn't enough. It simply isn't enough. But how good it is that we'll have tomorrow in lieu, in some respects, of awareness, near to truer respects than maybe we were otherwise growing together alongside of. And I think that is a lot for possibility ignited on a plane addressing work. I think it approaches impossible to look at somebody that's your father, your guider, your holy member of time, and look at them and feel like tomorrow is on its way to being good because, and thanks to a lot of caution tape, and maybe not extending it any further than that. There's some things that I've thought about. There's some reality that I've considered. There's some facts about envelope and time and pressure that are clearly presented. And in not feeling alone and the goodness to result, I think it's near to impossible for anybody to stand and look and say and feel these things with a holiness and be believed in and they look up to, and it isn't a guess, it isn't a big shot in the bucket from whenever, wherever. I think it approaches impossible. I know it approaches impossible realistically. And I think it's thanks to a lot of caution tape and maybe not much more than that. I think that the ocean of salt is rich in salt. And I think that shows when tomorrow knows how good it is. I think the birds have a way to be a little less crazy, and I think there's hope involved from a place that can't be touched also, because of the hearts we actually fear and won't have. I think there's a lot of untouchable hope in places. But I think that lot may become less in the hand when it's clear that it is possible to be touched and feel valuable in a way and in a light that maybe transcends how necessary the value you've placed on a problem needs to stay. And I think that's critical to acknowledge and to potentiate, because ruin of work requires comparison to know that it's not the expedition of sickness. Without necessity, without design, without creator saliva, I think it's near to impossible to look to the holy and render your fears of ruin of your work in a way, really, and feel, you recognize that he isn't alone on your mission to live where these near to coveted addressings of the spectacle of your life or your legacy, the forces that are more relative to one or some than they are obviously less relevant or relative to others, that caution tape goes a long way. And I hope that you're with me when I say that I don't believe that caution tape should be transformed into a Band-Aid for a microphone that everyone's dead and it seems like a war of drones to be less tumultuous for a benefited potentiate realm that enables your own to be extinguished. And I think it's a very near to difficult, if not impossible, place for any number of forces to walk a path and see or feel that, let alone arrive at the conclusion and see it in a light that is pertinent. And I think it's very, very, very hard to ever know that and need to worry about another world. You know it, but maybe they doesn't. You know it, and you're still calling them on the phone, and they doesn't. You know it, and whatever they're dealing with clearly has some relationship to your knowing it. But I think the times and moments whenever it's relevant in some sort of timely divinity or a holiness or a celebration or a survival envelope imperative, I think these times are going to be very, 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 very few. And I think the more that's without caution tape, the less of a goodness it's ever going to be. I think that reality to learn and feel like you have a legacy because you know it, to the ability to live and discover yourself because you don't have everyone who died, because now you're living and these are different times. I think reality rests a lot on minimal problems near the caution tape. And I don't think everybody that cares about time or cares about design or cares about trajectory or cares about space or survival, I don't think everybody that ever cares about these things is going to automatically be the ideal protector of all reality because of how much caution tape relates to reality. And probably the hardest science is you'll believe in me. You'll believe in what I've said. You'll believe it so much that we're going to need to determine why a potentiate realm and a caution tape realm can have any connection to one another. Any connection whatsoever. Because there's going to be a plethora of large and very large and maybe even one or two small ones operating a lathe in that gap. And as a fixation of possibility, I think that reality has one of the greatest potentiate gravities to shift the frame of necessity of a mind for the sake of growth of a mind. And face value is a term that's been taken quasi-seriously at least 3 or 4 times. At least 3. I don't know about 4, but couldn't be any less than 3. You probably can't imagine the world you have. Nobody is seeing caution tape. All the systems that are operating, there isn't a caution tape expert inside them. The potentiate stuff is flowing and the caution tape stuff is taking mark. They're just sort of wherever they are. And yet you know and from that moment forward, there's either a need or a spirit or a desire or you're compelled to want to be valuable, to near to needing to be valuable or capable or sustained. And it's clearly coming from somewhere. And do you believe life is good? Things like who wouldn't want more of it? And the time you've spent with the sound, no glasses. Fractured hearts. Resting prayers on more fractured potentiate. Three times as smart. 9 times as empty. Fading into the distance, the worry tape for no reason. Providing levity, no reason. Holding the ruin of a location. Holding definitely the ruin of survival, maybe. Holding definitely maybe the ruin of time passage and space telemetry and coexistence and worrying alone, but clearly isn't holding the ruin of the location. And so you get lost unsafely. No amount of the caution tape prepares you that it's unwise to even leave a breadcrumb. Because every visit on your trip to debauchery and knowing in the salvation of the impolite distance, you can't reasonably figure how to protect.